David Reed was doing his best not to nod off while Professor Helleth lectured on interstellar quarantine protocols. The four-armed Thessaran teacher paced the room, gesturing at a shimmering holographic chart. All around David, students from a dozen different planets were busy taking notes, their various eyes and appendages focused on the lesson. 3 months. That's how long he'd been part of the first ever human exchange program, and David was still blown away by the sheer diversity of life out here. To his left sat LRA, a Thessaran whose big, sparkly, compound eyes seemed to glitter whenever she got curious. Behind him, the massive frame of Bront, a hulking Kavarian, made the specially reinforced chair groan in protest. And across the aisle, Sila's gills gently fluttered behind the special humidity mask that kept her amphibious system from drying out. "Next week," Professor Helleth announced, tapping the display with a slender finger, "you will all be taking the hands-on final exam for your xenobiology certification." A wave of nervous energy rippled through the classroom. David finally sat up straight, his interest piqued. The practical test sounded way better than another lecture. "This is a standard exam across all Galactic Academy stations," the professor explained. "You'll be placed into simulated habitats designed to test your survival instincts and your knowledge of biology. Each scenario is built to challenge how you handle stress, adapt to your surroundings, and make decisions under pressure." LRA's antennae twitched. She leaned over and whispered through her translator, "Have you ever done a test like this?" David just shrugged. "Back home, I had to get my EMT certification. We did emergency drills and stuff all the time. It's no big deal." Suddenly, several students turned to stare at him. David caught them shooting strange glances at each other, some kind of silent conversation he couldn't follow. Professor Helleth's mandibles clicked, which David knew was her way of smiling. "The test is perfectly safe. We have been running these exams for over 300 years with 0 incidents. The simulations are designed to be a mild challenge, not a real danger." "What kind of challenges?" Bront asked, his deep voice rumbling. "Things like temperature changes, different air compositions, managing supplies, and measuring your body's basic stress response," Professor Helleth listed off. "Nothing that any starfaring species shouldn't be able to handle." This was the first time David had been genuinely excited since he got here. He'd spent 2 years as a paramedic in New Jersey before he was accepted into the exchange program, so he knew a thing or two about stress. A controlled test in a lab? That sounded almost like a vacation. "You will each be given basic supplies," the professor continued. "Water rations, nutrient bars, a med kit, and an emergency communicator. The challenges will get progressively harder, but you can quit at any time with no penalty. We measure your performance against your own species' biological baseline, so you aren't competing with each other." Sila raised a webbed hand. "How long does it usually take?" "Typically between 1 and 2 standard days, depending on how you pace yourself. Some finish fast, some take their time. There's no rush," Professor Helleth said, her eyes scanning the room. "I want to be clear. This is a routine part of your education. Thousands of students pass this test every year." "Will we be by ourselves?" LRA asked, her voice a little shaky. "Yes. Individual isolation is required to get an accurate reading of your personal stress response. But don't worry, you'll be monitored constantly, and a medical team will be on standby." The professor paused for a moment. "Any other questions?" David raised his hand. "Do we need to bring anything?" "No, all equipment is provided. Just show up at the testing center at dawn tomorrow wearing comfortable clothing, she replied, her antenna tilting toward David with an odd sense of curiosity. I assumed the human delegation has cleared you for this? Yeah, they said it was all good, David replied. He'd barely even read the permission slips he signed. The human coordinator had just said it was a standard academic requirement, and David had been more worried about his upcoming test on stellar cartography. As the classroom emptied out, David grabbed his datapad and headed for the hall. Lita intercepted him before he got far, her gait a strange sideways shuffle unique to her people. David, she murmured, her voice low as she checked to see if anyone was listening. I need to ask you something. Sure, Lita, what's on your mind? Her massive, compound eyes seemed to be analyzing him with a strange new intensity. Is it true? What everyone whispers about Earth? David leaned against a locker. And what is everyone whispering? Well, she hesitated. The official files call it a Class 12 Deathworld, but the rumor is that's being generous. David just laughed. Or maybe it's not nearly as bad as they say. I mean, sure, we have some crazy weather and a few big predators, but humans have been living there for hundreds of thousands of years. We're pretty tough. Tough? LRA repeated slowly. Yes, I suppose you would have to be. She gently touched his arm with one of her slender limbs. Just be careful tomorrow, David. Even routine tests can hold surprises. Don't worry, I'll be fine, David said with a grin. How hard can it be? As he walked toward his dorm, David didn't see how the other students would part ways to let him pass, or the look of deep concern on LRA's face as she watched him go. The testing facility was a massive, sterile white maze of corridors and observation rooms. David followed the signs to his assigned chamber, passing other students, who all looked incredibly nervous. At the door, a lanky medical technician with way too many joints in its arms greeted him. David Reed, the human exchange student? That's me. The technician's eye stalk swiveled, giving him a thorough once-over. Fascinating. Truly fascinating. Please proceed into Chamber 17. Your supplies are already inside. The room was small, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, with blank white walls that could probably project any image they wanted. A simple cot sat in the middle of the room, and on a shelf by the door were the promised supplies. 3 bottles of water, a box of protein bars, a first aid kit, and a small device with a big red emergency button. David took a seat on the cot and waited. A calm voice came through a speaker in the ceiling. Examination commencing. Phase 1. Thermal regulation. Please remain calm and seated. The temperature in the room slowly began to rise. David took off his jacket. A few minutes passed, and the air went from warm to hot like a typical summer afternoon back in Jersey. He was so unbothered that he pulled out his tablet and started reading a novel he'd been meaning to finish. After about 20 minutes, the temperature leveled off. David barely noticed. He was used to those humid, sticky East Coast summers that felt like you were breathing water. This dry heat was actually kind of nice, but up in the observation room 3 floors above, Professor Heath was staring at his vital signs in complete disbelief. The temperature inside Chamber 17 had reached a level that would cause serious distress in most known species. But David's heart rate was a steady 68 beats per minute. His breathing was even. He was just casually reading a book. Are you sure the equipment is working? Professor Heath asked the monitoring technician. Yes, Professor. All sensors are green. The human, Appears to be perfectly comfortable. Meanwhile, in the chamber next door, Scylla had already hit her emergency button. The low humidity was causing her amphibious skin to crack, and 2 rooms down, the massive Bront was panting heavily, his body struggling to cool itself down. David just turned a page on his tablet, lost in the story. Then the calm voice returned. Phase 2, atmospheric adjustment. Please continue to breathe normally. The air suddenly felt a little thinner, kind of like being high up in the mountains. He'd gone hiking in Colorado once and remembered the feeling of having to take slightly deeper breaths. He adjusted without a second thought. Huh, he mumbled to himself. Feels like Denver in here. In the observation room, red lights started flashing on the console. The oxygen in David's chamber had been lowered by 15%, a drop that should have triggered severe respiratory distress. His blood oxygen level is still at 97%, the technician exclaimed, its translated voice filled with shock. That's not possible in this atmosphere. Professor Helleth frantically pulled up David's official file. It read, Homeworld, Earth, Classification, Class 12, Deathworld, Standard Sea Level Atmospheric Pressure 101.3 kilopascals, Oxygen Concentration 21%. She ran the numbers again, convinced there was a mistake. But there wasn't. Humans evolved in an atmosphere that was practically a poison to most other species in the galaxy. The air David considered normal was so rich in oxygen it would cause cellular damage to most aliens. By lowering it 15%, they had accidentally brought the air down to what the Galactic Academy considered a perfectly safe, comfortable, and ideal breathing environment. What happens when you put a totally normal guy from a planet everyone underestimates into the galaxy's toughest entrance exam? You're about to find out. And trust me, you'll want to stick around for the ending. It all started with the third test. A low oxygen simulation. A voice announced the pressure was dropping, and while most species would be gasping for air, David just felt his ears pop like he was on a flight. He cleared them and went right back to his book. Just as David let out a yawn, the student in Chamber 9, a brawn from a low-gravity world, completely collapsed. Medics swarmed in. His body just couldn't handle the kind of pressure changes Earthborn humans deal with just driving through a mountain pass. That's when Professor Helleth made a call that would change everything. Put him on the advanced protocols, she ordered. The four-eyed technician swiveled to face her. Professor, those tests are for species from lethal environments. They're not on the standard list. I know, she said firmly. Do it. Meanwhile, David finished a chapter and stretched, thinking this whole exam was easier than a slow Tuesday back at the hospital. He was starting to wonder when the hard part would kick in. Next scenario, the voice chirped, environmental irritant. This is optional and you can decline. Nah, I'm good, David shouted back. Keep 'em coming. A fine mist started spraying from the ceiling, smelling like a mix of industrial bleach and pepper spray. His eyes started to water and he sneezed. Twice. Wow, that stuff is potent, he remarked, wiping his nose. Smells like the cleaning solution we used back in the ER. On the other side of the glass, the monitors showed toxin levels that should have put David in a coma. Instead, he just sneezed a third time and suggested they crack a window. Professor Helleth stared at the numbers scrolling across her screen. David's system was breaking down poisons that would drop most known life forms where they stood. His nose was a little runny, but his lungs were perfectly fine. Professor, the technician whispered. What in the universe is he? Professor Howlett didn't have an answer. She was too busy thinking that maybe labeling Earth a Class 12 hazard zone was the biggest understatement in galactic history. She called an emergency meeting with the facility director and the human exchange coordinator. The three of them sat in a locked room, watching the footage of David breezing through the tests on a loop. "We have to stop this," said Director Prass, his crystalline body shimmering nervously. "This human is way outside expected norms." "He volunteered for everything," the human coordinator Rachel Kim pointed out with a grin, "and his vitals are rock solid." "That's the entire problem," Professor Helleth exclaimed. "Your species seems to have developed tolerances that break our most extreme tests. We built these scenarios from data on 3,000 species from over 1,200 worlds. David is treating life-threatening situations like they're a minor hassle." Rachel just shrugged. "Earth can be a rough place. You learn to adapt. Your planet is a Class 12 death world," Director Prass countered. 98% of spacefaring species would need a full hazard suit just to breathe what you call normal air. "So, David's acing the test," Rachel said. "What's not to like?" Professor Helleth pulled up a chart. "This is David's stress level compared to the average. See anything odd?" Rachel looked. David's line was almost perfectly flat, while everyone else's shot straight up. "He's calm," she said. "That's a good thing, right?" "He shouldn't be calm. He should be in severe physical distress." The professor pointed to another section. "The toxin test. At this concentration, he should be unconscious. Instead, David sneezed." "Humans sneeze when things irritate our noses," Rachel explained patiently. "It's a protective reflex." "Protective," Director Prass repeated slowly. "Yes, we're starting to see that your definition of protective and ours are two very, very different things." Despite their deep concerns, they let the tests go on, but with way more monitoring. They told David the next part would be tougher and gave him another chance to quit. He just laughed. "Honestly, this is pretty fascinating," he said to the room's camera. "I've never had a physical this thorough before." The next test was a simulated injury. They gave him a fake arm with a nasty-looking wound and a basic first aid kit. The goal was to see how students reacted to trauma and stress. Most got sick just looking at it. Many students just flat out refused to do this part. But David, a former EMT, treated it like he was back in training. "Okay, first things first, stop the bleeding," he said to himself, not knowing they were recording his every word. "Apply direct pressure. Elevate. No arterial spray, that's good. Gotta clean it out. Check for any junk in there. This kit has some antibacterial stuff. Great. Now, wrap it tight enough to stop the bleeding, but not so tight you cut off circulation." He was done in 4 minutes. The galactic average was 18 minutes, and that's only for the ones who didn't pass out. "He's giving a lecture," Professor Helleth marveled. "He's teaching the correct procedure while under exam conditions," she said in disbelief. "David worked in an emergency room back on Earth," Rachel explained. "This is literally what he did for a living." "Your people train ordinary citizens for this?" "We train a lot of people. You never know when you might need to help someone." That quiet statement landed with the weight of a meteor. A species that saw so much trauma, they taught first aid like it was a basic life skill. A world so dangerous that patching up a terrible wound was common knowledge. They moved on. Next was food deprivation. After 18 hours, most students were showing major mental and physical decline. By the 40-hour mark, they had to pull several students out for medical emergencies. David just casually mentioned that he sometimes gets busy and forgets to eat breakfast, and kept right on working. His body was burning through energy reserves designed for a species that used to hunt by chasing animals until they literally died of exhaustion. "How long can a human survive without food?" Director Prass asked Rachel. "Depends. With water, a healthy person can last a few weeks. We're pretty efficient at conserving energy." "A few weeks?" Professor Helleth whispered. "Most species face organ failure after 5 to 7 days. "Yeah, humans are good at not dying," Rachel said with a proud smile. "It's kind of our superpower." Meanwhile, in her dorm room, another student named Liara had hacked into the observation feed. She watched David's data scroll by, her own test scores from last year looking pathetic in comparison. The numbers just didn't make sense. David was thriving in conditions labeled extreme hazard. He was chilling in environments marked unsurvivable, and his vitals showed he wasn't even breaking a sweat. Elara pulled up the official file on Earth. Class 12 Deathworld. Vicious wildlife, insane weather, constant earthquakes, high gravity, blistering radiation, and more deadly germs than a bioweapons lab, and humans called this place home. They didn't just survive there. They had barbecues there. They built cities on that chaotic rock. They evolved to see a living nightmare as perfectly normal. She thought about David's friendly smile and how he was always helping other students. This creature, forged in a world that would kill her in minutes, was genuinely a nice guy. Lara shut down the files and just sat in the dark, trying to wrap her head around what it truly meant to have humanity out here in the galaxy. Back in the observation room, the faculty was gathered for the final test. Professor Heleth had insisted on the pain tolerance exam despite the director's protests. "The data is too important," she argued. "This is the standard protocol. We use controlled electrical jolts in increasing levels. Most species tap out at level 3. Level 5 is considered extreme pain. Level 7 causes a severe trauma response," she continued. "No student in the history of this academy has ever gone past level 8. Down in the chamber, David sat calmly with electrodes on his arm. A voice explained he could say stop at any time. The test was about to begin. "Ready when you are," David said with a grin. Level 1 started. It felt like a little static shock. David said he felt it, but his vital signs didn't budge. Level 2 was a sharper zap, like touching a hot pan for a second. His heart rate stayed as calm as ever. Then came level 3, the point where almost every other species in the galaxy quit. Imagine being put through a pain test so intense it would make a warrior scream, only to find it kind of annoying. For David, that was just another Tuesday. He frowned slightly. "That's a little uncomfortable," he said, "but not too bad. Call it a level 4. The alien staff just stared at each other. David's jaw clenched, but he didn't even think about quitting. "Level 5, they announced. This level of pain was designed to cause severe distress in almost every species they'd ever tested. David just took a slow, deep breath. "Yeah, I can feel that," he said with a nod. "Kinda like a really bad muscle cramp." Professor Helleth leaned in closer, her eyes glued to the biometric readouts. The pain was definitely registering in David's nervous system. His brain saw the signals, but his body's stress response was barely there, and he was willingly asking for more. "Level 6, the technician announced, looking to Professor Helleth for a confirmation nod before pushing the button. She gave it. David winced for the first time. Okay, that's definitely a sharp one, he admitted. Reminds me of when I broke my finger playing basketball back in high school. Director Pratt, horrified, cut in. You broke a bone and you kept playing a recreational game? Rachel, watching from the observation deck, just smirked. You tape it up and get back on the court. It's just a finger. Level 7. This was a level of pain officially classified as torture for most known species, even used as a form of punishment in some cultures. David gritted his teeth as sweat popped on his forehead, but he still didn't ask them to stop. Hey, is this machine working right? He asked through his clenched jaw. I mean, it's intense, but from the way you guys were talking, I expected a lot worse. The entire monitoring staff was completely speechless. The human was asking if torture-level pain was strong enough. The equipment is calibrated correctly, the technician finally stammered. Would you like to continue to level 8? Sure, David said. Let's see what that's all about. The light flashed. David's hand instantly balled into a tight fist. His breathing hitched, and for the first time you could see real, genuine pain etched on his face. After 10 seconds, he let out a sharp breath. Okay, yep, that's pretty rough. I think I'm good. You guys probably have enough data now, right? Professor Helleth didn't even realize she'd been holding her breath. David had willingly endured agony that would have made most creatures pass out from shock, and he only stopped because he figured their experiment was done, not because he couldn't take it anymore. Next up were the temperature tolerance tests. They exposed David to cold that should have sent him into hypothermia. His body just started shivering, an automatic response where his muscles twitched to generate their own heat. He said he was cold, sure, but he was perfectly fine. The heat tests went about the same. David just started sweating, with beads of moisture popping up on his skin to cool him down as it evaporated. The alien students watching the recording were completely freaked out by this. Their species had to change their environment to regulate temperature. Humans, on the other hand, just secreted liquid right out of their bodies. That is horrifying, Sila whispered to Laura as they watched from the student lounge. They leak. They do not leak, Laura corrected, even though she was just as creeped out. It's a biological adaptation, a very effective one, apparently. The last part of the exam was purely physical. They just asked David to do simple tasks until he was too tired to continue. Walking, climbing stairs, lifting some weights, basic exercises. After 1 hour, he was still going strong. After 2 hours, the staff started to look tired just from watching him. After 3 hours, David was drenched in sweat, but showed absolutely no sign of giving up. So is there a time limit on this thing? He called out, not even out of breath. Because I can keep this up all day if you need more data. Professor Helleth glanced at the monitors. His muscles were showing signs of fatigue, but he was nowhere near failure. His heart and lungs were working hard, but they were well within a sustainable pace. His body was literally built for this, shaped by evolution to chase down prey for miles and miles until it just collapsed from exhaustion. You may stop, David, Professor Helleth finally said. We have sufficient data. David stopped and did a quick stretch. Cool, he said. That was a good workout. Hey, do you guys have a gym on this station? I really need to get back into a regular routine. The very idea of deliberately stressing out your own body for health benefits was so bizarre, so alien, that several of the observers had to have it explained to them over and over before they could even grasp the concept. Humans damage their muscles on purpose so they grow back stronger, Rachel explained patiently. We push our cardiovascular system to its limits all the time to increase its capacity. We call it training. Your species has weaponized self-harm as a health practice, Director Prass said, looking pale. Rachel just smiled. We call it fitness. David was given some time to recover. Medical scans showed some minor inflammation in his muscles, tiny tears that were already starting to heal. In fact, his healing process was dramatically faster than any other species they had on record. It was like his immune system was so aggressive, so used to constant damage, that it was prepared for it. While David rested, Professor Helleth put together her initial report. The human hadn't just passed their tests. He hadn't just broken their records, he had shattered them. He treated their most extreme tests like they were mild inconveniences, and he stayed cheerful and cooperative the entire time. Earth wasn't a Class 12 death world. It was something else entirely, and humanity was the proof. David sat in the debriefing room, sipping water and filling out a survey about his experience. He rated most of the tests as moderately challenging and wrote that the pain tolerance test was interesting, but not much worse than a tough day at the gym. Professor Helleth walked in to go over the results with him when suddenly the alarms blared. Red lights flashed everywhere. A calm, robotic voice echoed through the station. Containment breach in Xenobiology Laboratory. All personnel initiate lockdown protocols. Hazmat teams respond to Section 7. The door to the debriefing room hissed shut and sealed itself. Through the transparent wall, David could see other students and staff scrambling, looking for a safe place to hide. Professor Helleth's antennae went stiff with pure terror. What kind of containment breach? David asked, his emergency medical training kicking in instantly. Unknown, she replied, her voice trembling. The xenobiology lab holds specimens from hostile environments. Some are deadly pathogens, others are highly aggressive predators. She rushed over to the communication panel. We should be safe in here. The room is environmentally sealed. Just then, David heard a loud grinding noise from the walls, followed by a hiss. The station's ventilation system shuddered to a halt. That can't be good, he said. Professor Helleth was already checking the environmental controls, her mandibles clicking nervously. The breach has compromised life support. Temperature regulation is failing. Air recycling is offline. Even as she spoke, David could feel the air in the room starting to change. The perfectly controlled atmosphere that kept dozens of different species alive and comfortable was falling apart. And to make things worse, the creature that had escaped had released a cloud of spores into the vents right before they shut down. All across the station, students started to panic as the environment turned toxic for them. A massive alien named Bront collapsed in the hallway, his huge body unable to handle the sudden temperature shift. Sila's breathing grew ragged as the humidity vanished from the air. One by one, aliens were starting to show signs of distress as their specific needs were no longer being met. David quickly sized up the situation. His room was holding steady for now, but he could see students collapsing just outside the window. Elara stumbled past, her big compound eyes already looking dull and her movements sluggish. "Can you open this door?" David asked the professor. "Absolutely not," Helleth shot back. "The contamination out there could be lethal. We have to wait for the hazmat teams." "How long will that take?" he pressed. "They have to suit up, figure out what the contaminant is, and then plan a response. Maybe 20 minutes. David looked over at Laura, who had now slumped against the far wall. 20 minutes was too long. He could see her struggling to breathe, her body failing in an environment that had suddenly become hostile. "I'm going out there," David stated, his voice firm. "You will die," Professor Helleth said flatly. "The organism is a parasitic fungus from a Class 9 death world. Exposure without a suit is a death sentence." But David was already at the door controls. His first responder training had a simple rule: you can't help anyone if you become a victim yourself. But as he looked at Olara and the others suffering in the hall, he made a choice. "Override the lock," he commanded. "I cannot allow you to—" "Professor," David interrupted, "I'm going to break this door down if you don't open it. Your choice." Something in his voice, a cold certainty, made her obey. The door unsealed. David stepped out into chaos. The air smelled wrong, thick and musty like rotting plants. The temperature dropped instantly, hitting a level that was probably dangerously cold for most of the aliens. To David, it felt like a crisp fall day back in New Jersey. He got to Elra first, checking her vital signs with his hands. Her pulse was faint, her body was cold. He gently scooped her up and carried her to a small alcove that seemed a little more sheltered. "Stay here," he told her softly. "Breathe slow." Laura's eyes struggled to focus on him. "David, the spores. You're exposed." "I'll worry about that later," he said, already moving back into the corridor to find others who needed help. Bront was way too heavy to move, but David quickly checked his breathing and rolled him into the recovery position to keep his airway open. He found a small crystalline student whose body had started to crack from the thermal shock, and David carefully wrapped her in his own jacket to keep her stable. All the while, the air was getting thicker. David could feel the alien spores entering his lungs, trying to take root. But his immune system, forged by fighting off millions of years of Earth's germs and viruses, immediately recognized the invader and launched an all-out war. As his body temperature ticked up, his immune system flared to life. The invading spores, perfectly evolved for the cooler bodies of most galactic life, found themselves in a furnace. They started dying off, but David had no idea. He was too busy sorting through the chaos, figuring out which students needed help first. His old EMT training snapped into place, a calm voice in his head. Airway, breathing, circulation, stop the bleeding, treat for shock. When the hazmat team finally clomped in, looking like giant marshmallows in their bulky suits, they found David on his knees beside a young Mir student, talking her through it. "You're doing great," he said, his voice steady. "Help is here now. Just stay with me, okay?" The team leader froze, staring at this human, this completely unprotected human, working in a hot zone. David had been in here for over 10 minutes. By all accounts, he should be on the floor with the rest of them. Instead, he was the first responder. "Sir, you need to get out of here, now." The team leader's voice crackled through the comms. "Almost," David said without looking up. "She needs fluids and a thermal blanket. The big guy over there is unconscious, needs a lift. The crystalline student is stable but has some cracks." The leader tried again. "Sir, you've been exposed to a Class 9 fungal agent." David finally looked up. "Yeah, I figured. I'll get checked out once everyone else is on their way." The hazmat crew moved with renewed urgency, getting the 6 students prepped for transport. David was the last one out, making one final check to be sure they hadn't missed anyone. In the med bay, doctors swarmed him. The scans came back and they were baffled. The spores in his lungs were completely dead. Not dormant, not weakened, but obliterated. His immune system had waged a silent lightning-fast war and left no survivors. 3 days later, David stood in front of the Galactic Academy board. The chamber was immense, built to hold 50 different species, and he felt incredibly small. He'd worn his best uniform and was trying his best not to fidget while the board members stared at him like he was a puzzle they couldn't solve. Chancellor Dreth, an ancient Netheran whose crystalline form bent the light into thoughtful rainbows, spoke first. "David Reed of Earth," he began, "you have completed the standard xenobiology entrance exam, and you have responded to a campus-wide emergency. The board has analyzed the data from both incidents. We have some questions." "Happy to answer anything I can," David said. Professor Haleth brought up a hologram showing a clip from his stress testing. "Here, you remained comfortable at temperatures that rendered other candidates unconscious," the professor noted. "Can you explain this?" David just shrugged. "Earth gets pretty hot. You just get used to it. We sweat to cool off. It's actually pretty effective." "You secrete liquid from your pores?" a board member asked, sounding deeply disturbed. "Yeah," David said. "Evaporative cooling. Works like a charm." The hologram switched to the low oxygen test. "You continued to function normally in an atmosphere that should have induced severe hypoxia. What percentage of oxygen is typical for your species?" "Around 21% at sea level," David answered. "But we've got mountains, high-altitude cities. We're pretty good at adapting." Several board members scribbled notes furiously. Chancellor Dreth spoke again. "During the pain tolerance portion, you chose to continue the test all the way to level 8. Most species lose consciousness around level 7. Why?" "Well, you said it was optional," David explained. "I figured the more data you had, the better, so I just kept going until it got to be a bit much." He paused, then asked, "Was that not the right thing to do?" "No," Professor Haleth said, his voice soft. "It was just surprising." "How did you develop such a high tolerance for pain?" another member asked. David had to think for a second. "I guess it's just part of life for us. I've broken bones playing sports, gotten hurt on the job, twisted my ankle on a hike. Pain happens. You just learn to push through it." A silent, rippling wave of communication seemed to pass between the board members. Finally, the Chancellor pulled up a file titled Earth. "Your planet is listed as a Class 12 death world. After reviewing this new data, we now believe that classification is inaccurate." David's stomach dropped. This was it. They were kicking him out, probably banning all humans. "Earth," the Chancellor continued, "should be reclassified as a Class 15 or possibly higher." He went on, listing the reasons. Its gravity is crushingly high. The atmosphere is a borderline corrosive mix of gases. The weather systems are violently unpredictable. The native wildlife includes predators that would be classified as biological weapons on most civilized worlds. The planet itself is unstable, with constant tectonic shifts, and it's bathed in solar radiation levels that should be lethal. David just blinked. "I mean, it's not so bad once you get used to it," he offered weakly. "You get used to it," a board member whispered in awe. "Humans consider a Class 15 death world normal." "We've been there a long time," David said. "A couple 100,000 years, give or take. We evolved to fit the place." Chancellor Dreth leaned forward. During the containment breach, you were exposed to a pathogen with a 100% mortality rate. You displayed 0 symptoms. Our scans show your immune system utterly destroyed it. How is this possible? I don't really know, David admitted. My body just took care of it. I didn't even feel it. You possess an immune system that can defeat a Class 9 pathogen without any medical help. David shifted on his feet. Is that not normal? It is profoundly not normal, the Chancellor said. Most species here require a lifetime of inoculations just to survive Class 3 microbes. You fought off a Class 9 while performing emergency first aid on others. They needed help, David said simply. That's just what you do. You help. The board was quiet for a full minute. Then a tiny insectoid member spoke. We reviewed the contents of the human's personal data device. It contains images of a creature he calls a dog. He refers to it as a pet. Yeah, my dog, Buddy. He's a golden retriever, David said. The member continued. Our records showed these dogs are the direct descendants of apex predators, wolves, pack hunters that took down prey 10 times their own size. Well, yeah, David said, but we domesticated them ages ago. They're mostly just goofy and friendly now. Man's best friend. You keep tamed apex predators inside your homes for companionship? They're good boys, David insisted, feeling a strange need to defend all of dog kind. Another member displayed a photo from David's file. And this, an activity you call rock climbing. You are scaling a vertical cliff face with no flight assistance. Oh, that's just a hobby. It's a lot of fun. Fun, the member repeated slowly. You risk death by falling for recreation. Well, you use ropes and stuff, David said. Usually. The board looked like it was collectively having a system crash. Chancellor Dreth cleared his throat, bringing up one last file. The board was tasked with determining if humans are too dangerous for this academy. David's heart sank again. After a thorough review, the Chancellor said, his voice ringing with authority, we have concluded that while you are a product of a terrifyingly hostile world, you are not dangerous. In fact, you are the opposite. You are protectors. Earth's brutal environment didn't create a species of conquerors. It created a species of survivors who value cooperation and compassion above all else. David, he said, looking directly at him, your first instinct in a crisis was not to save yourself, but to save everyone else. It seems humanity was forged in fire not to become a weapon, but a shield. The relief that washed over David was overwhelming. Therefore, this exchange program will be expanded, effective immediately. We are formally requesting more human candidates for our emergency response divisions, hazardous environment teams, and deep space exploration corps. Your people are simply too valuable to the galactic community to ignore. Later, Professor Helleth caught up with him. Your actions have fundamentally changed our understanding of your species. We saw you as monsters from a nightmare world, the professor admitted. But we were wrong. You're guardians. David just smiled. We're just people, Professor. Earth made us tough, but it also taught us that we have to look out for each other. That's the part that really matters. That night, he sent a message home, trying to explain the crazy adventure he'd had and how he'd accidentally become the galactic poster boy for what it means to be human. Earth was a dangerous place, sure, but it had made something truly special.